All right, so when an economy hits a rough patch, the government doesn't just sit on the sidelines. It actually has a specific set of tools it can use to try and get things back on track. Today, we're going to open up that toolbox and get to grips with what we call fiscal policy. So just imagine the economy is facing one of two huge problems. Either it's shrinking into a recession, people are losing their jobs, or it's totally overheating with prices just spiraling out of control. So what can the government actually do? Well, that's the big question that fiscal policy is designed to answer. And that answer is fiscal policy. At its heart, it's really just about how the government uses two main levers: its own spending and the taxes it collects to nudge the economy in the right direction. It's so important to remember this is not the same as monetary policy. That's handled by central banks. Fiscal policy, that's all down to the politicians. Okay, so let's look inside this toolbox. You'll find there are two main instruments, right? These are the primary levers the government can pull to try and steer the economy. So on one hand, you've got government spending, which we call G. This is all the money spent on things like new motorways, hospitals, schools, and defense. When the government decides to spend more, it's like it's injecting a shot of cash straight into the economy. Then on the other hand, you've got taxation, or T. This is how the government makes its money. So if it cuts taxes, we all have a bit more in our pockets to spend. But if it raises taxes, it's basically taking money out of circulation. Right, so we know what the tools are. But how, and more importantly, when do you use them? Well, that's where the user manual comes in, and it basically outlines two different game plans: expansionary policy and contractionary policy. This table lays it out perfectly. Look, if the economy is in a recession, the goal is pretty obvious. You want to kickstart growth and get people back into jobs. So the government uses expansionary policy. That means it either spends more money or it cuts our taxes. Simple. But what if the economy is overheating and inflation is soaring? Well, it's got to do the complete opposite. It uses contractionary policy. That means cutting its spending or raising taxes to try and cool things down.
A great way to think about expansionary policy is like hitting the accelerator in a car. The government is trying to speed up the economy to fight off a slowdown and get unemployment down. But what's the trade-off? Well, this often leads to a budget deficit, which is when the government ends up spending more than it's bringing in through taxes.
And on the flip side, contractionary policy is like hitting the brakes. The whole point is to slow down an economy that's running too hot, to get inflation under control before it really causes problems. And if they get it right, this can lead to a budget surplus, where the tax money coming in is actually more than the government is spending. Now let's talk about a concept that is absolutely essential for your exams. It's what makes these tools way more powerful than they first appear: the fiscal multiplier. Seriously, think of it like a power-up feature in a video game that just amplifies the impact of whatever the government does. This quote just nails it. The first bit of money the government spends has this ripple effect that ends up being much, much bigger than that original amount. Let's walk through how that actually works. Okay, let's follow the money. Say the government spends 100 rupees on a new road. A construction worker earns that 100 rupees. Now, she's not going to stash it all under her mattress, right? She goes out and spends some of it, let's say 80 rupees, at a local shop. Well, now the shopkeeper has an extra 80 rupees, and he then goes and spends a chunk of that somewhere else. You see, it creates this chain reaction. Even though each round of spending gets a little smaller, when you add it all up, the final boost to the economy is way bigger than the government's initial 100 rupees. And that right there is the multiplier effect in action. But, and this is a big but, fiscal policy is not some magic wand. To really get those top marks, you have to understand its limitations. Think of these as the big warning labels on the side of the toolbox. The first massive problem is time. Fiscal policy can be incredibly, painfully slow to put into action, and this creates these really significant delays, or what we call lags. This whole process has 3 stages. First, you've got the recognition lag. It just takes time for economists and politicians to look at the data and agree, yep, we have a problem. Then comes the decision lag. This is the really slow bit, with all the political debates about what to do and how to pass the new laws. I mean, it's always easier to pass a popular tax cut than an unpopular tax hike, right? And finally, you get the implementation lag, the time it takes for the actual money to be spent and start circulating. The real danger here is that by the time the policy finally kicks in, the economic problem it was supposed to fix might have completely changed. Okay, the second critical limitation you absolutely have to know is something called the crowding out effect. And this is all about a side effect of how the government pays for its big spending plans. So, think about it. To pay for an expansionary policy, especially if it's creating a budget deficit, the government usually has to borrow a ton of money. It does this by selling bonds to the public and to financial institutions. Now, when a massive borrower, like the government, suddenly needs a huge amount of cash, what happens? It dramatically increases the overall demand for loans in the economy. And basic economics tells us that when demand goes up, the price goes up. In this case, the price of borrowing is the interest rate. So, interest rates start to rise for everybody. And here's the kicker, the real consequence. When interest rates go up, it becomes more expensive for private companies to borrow money for their own projects, like building a new factory or researching new technology. So what do? They invest less. The government's attempt to boost the economy has accidentally crowded out private investment, which can seriously weaken the whole point of the policy in the first place. So let's just boil this all down to the key exam takeaways. 1. Fiscal policy uses government spending and taxation. 2. In a recession, you go expansionary. That's more spending, lower taxes. 3. When inflation is high, you go contractionary. Less spending, higher taxes. 4. The multiplier effect juices up these actions, making them bigger. And 5, and this is crucial, always remember the big limitations, those time lags and the risk of crowding out. Which leaves us with one final big question to think about. Given how powerful it can be, but also how slow it is and the side effects it can cause, is fiscal policy a precise tool, like a surgeon's scalpel, carefully fixing economic problems? Or is it more like a clumsy hammer? Yeah, it's powerful, but it's slow to swing, and sometimes you end up causing a bit of unintended damage. Thinking about that trade-off, that's the key to really mastering fiscal policy.